7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Seamus.
Welcome back. I think we all very much enjoyed that session between Bob Headland and the Minister Malcolm Noonan. So we're back with our mainstream lectures again. And just before I introduce you to the next lecture, every year we publish our journal of the autumn school called Nimrod. Here it is. Unfortunately, there's no one here to buy it this year. So I'm asking if you're interested in getting a copy of this year's Nimrod, email the museum at info@shackletonmuseum.com. Our next lecturer, Bob Burton, has a very interesting and amusing piece called Rescued by Penguins, the unsung role of penguins in Antarctic exploration. And it segues nicely into his lecture today, which is called The Use of Ponies in the Antarctica. Was it a silly idea? And here's Bob Burton to answer his own question.
Yes, something entirely different. This is a work in progress. In fact, it's been in progress for about 10 years. And I can't remember why on earth I took it on. It's lost in time. But I started reading up about ponies being used on polar expeditions and fascinating stories. And I thought rather grandiosely that I'd try a review of ponies in polar explorations. But that was before I found how many expeditions used ponies in the Arctic, from Vitus Bering in 1725 to 1730 out in East Asia, through to Lauger Koch in northeast Greenland in the 1940s. So I've been the Arctic bit, and I'm concentrating on Antarctica, which essentially means 2 expeditions: Shackleton's Nimrod expedition, which nearly got to the pole, and Scott's Terra Nova expedition, which got to the pole but didn't get back. And both expeditions were using ponies as their prime means of transport. And you hear now, you read now that taking horses to Antarctica is absolutely ridiculous because ponies aren't designed for cold weather. Well, actually they are. They have a suite of behavioral, physical and physiological adaptations for life in cold climates. And as I read through these things, one sort of question really came out was that horses or ponies are basically small horses which have round bodies and short legs, fair-wool animals, in other words. They were used extensively for centuries in the north. So why did our 2 heroes, Shackleton and Scott, find so much difficulty with them? And incidentally, if you don't recognize the picture in front of you, this is Shackleton and his 3 companions setting off towards the South Pole with their ponies. The men came back, the ponies didn't. So have a look at the earliest historical record of horses being used in Arctic conditions. And you can see this was a book by Olaus Magnus. He was a Swedish priest. Real name was Olaf Hansson. And the picture shows a merchant leading his pack horse loaded with goodies from Norway to sell in Sweden. And you can see that the man is wearing snowshoes, the horse is wearing snowshoes, and even the staff is snowshod. So they had the technology for moving across snow in cold temperatures. And the animals are well suited. These are Siberian ponies, exist in much colder temperatures than in Scandinavia, right down to sort of could be -70 centigrade during the winter, very long winters. These ponies live outdoors the year round. They're very often not fed. They have to rely on scraping the snow away to get to grass, but they've put on a lot of weight before the winter. They've got long winter coats, and you can see from the one inset, they've got not only long coats, but very long manes. And this one, it looks like sort of King Charles II with his wig, and it probably bumps into things because it can't see. But they are eminently suited for polar travel. In fact, one important point is that the coldest temperatures that they will be meeting are warmer than the temperatures that they would meet on the ice barrier, the Ross ice shelf, with Shackleton and Scott. So the temperature down there is not a problem. It might be more windy, which is a problem, but again, these animals can cope. They stick their backsides into the wind, their tails wrap under the body to keep the delicate bits warm, and they put their heads down and just see the gales out. So we've got the technology, we've got the animals, and we'll have a quick run through of the use of these ponies in Antarctica. This is Scott's first expedition aboard Discovery, and he used huskies for traction, for pulling the sledges. And you see a couple of them here coming up to see the photographer. And the high point, or even low point, of this expedition was the journey that Scott made to get the farthest south record. And he chose his great friend Edward Wilson to go with him. And Wilson very sensibly said, we need a third man for safety, so that if one man gets crocked or ill, the other two can get him back. And they chose Shackleton because he was so enthusiastic. He was life and soul of the expedition, an obvious chap to take too. And while we're on it, a little nugget, you see they had this conceit of having their personal sledge flags with their coats of arms, and this is the Shackleton coat of arms, and heralds go in for punning. So these diamonds are heraldic shackles, which of course is a nickname of Shackleton. Irrelevant, but interesting little note. They set off pulled by dogs, by their huskies, which very soon lost condition, failed, and eventually died. Wilson said it was because their food was tainted, and their food was dried fish brought from Europe, which is useless food for a working dog. They need lumps of seal flesh with lots of rich blubber to give them plenty of calories to keep them going, pulling loaded sledges and keeping them warm. So the sledge dogs died, and the men had to man-haul back. They got scurvy, and Shackleton only just got back and was duly sent home because he wasn't really fit. It was hard luck on him. And it's not surprising that subsequently Scott and Shackleton were really rather anti-dog. They should perhaps have learnt from their experiences and made better. Now, there was a lot of discussion in the wardroom of the Discovery of the best way to get to the South Pole. And they were thinking ponies and dogs. And the main proponent of ponies was Albertrmitage, who'd been on an Arctic expedition. And you can see on the left, he swings the praises of Siberian ponies, that they are really much better than dogs. And he says, moreover, I like this, the pony is far more palatable in case of need than the dog. In fact, in case of need, anything is palatable, even your boots. Now, the expedition that Armitage had been on, he was second in command of the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition to Franz Josef Land. And Frederick Jackson on the left there, he was a sort of archetypal Victorian explorer. Private means, didn't have to worry about earning a living, and free to wander around the less well-known parts of the world, shooting the wildlife and learning the habits of the natives. Before he went on this expedition to Franz Josef Land, he'd done a long trek through Western Siberia. He started off on reindeer-drawn sledges, then switched to ponies, and found that they were absolutely excellent. He was really full of praise for them. They were tough, hardy, fast, do anything animals. And he decided to take 4 of them on this expedition to Franz Josef Land and set up base there. And they did several journeys of exploration. They discovered that Franz Josef was an archipelago. There was a hope that it might be a land link that you could take to the North Pole without getting your feet wet in the sea. But archipelago rather crashed that idea. But they did these several journeys with their ponies. You can see 4 of them. And Jackson was later to write, "These ponies proved to be an unqualified success for use on land flows and glaciers." By land flow, he means the fast ice, which is attached to the land. Unfortunately, some of the trips took them out onto the sea ice, and it was in spring, and the crisp snow was melting into slush. The ice was breaking up into flows, and there were gaps into which ponies, dogs, and men could fall. In the end, all 4 ponies died, and detractors of ponies will point this out, but he also lost nearly all his dogs and very nearly the men. Really, at that time of year, only a fool would travel in the Arctic, and I know because I've done it. It wasn't my idea, but really the only decent form of transport at that time is a helicopter. Anyway, it's a successful expedition, and by this time Shackleton, well, long after Shackleton has got back from the Antarctic, he's decided to set up his own expedition to try to get to the South Pole, and he starts off by suggesting that he'd use dogs, as he said if only they'd had more dogs when he was with Scott and Wilson, they'd have got to the South Pole. But then he changes his mind and goes for ponies. And I think that this was after he'd had a meeting with Jackson, who'd obviously promoted the idea of ponies. And so Shackleton, he orders some Manchurian ponies, which are sent down to New Zealand to join him. And here they are. I mean, this is absolute bliss for Siberian ponies grazing like this. Little did they know what they were going to go to down in the Antarctic. So they are shipped south. It's a terrible journey on the Nimrod. They're thrown around. He buys 15 ponies. He takes 10 on the Nimrod, perhaps because there isn't room for the others. 2 die on the journey, and 8 come ashore. Thing is that they're unbroken when they get to New Zealand, and here they are being trained by a chap called Tubman, local gent, and also one of the Shackleton's men, Alistair Mackay, who was the expedition doctor, but also had served in the cavalry in the Boer War. And they seem to have been successful because suppose photographs, they look very tame, at least for the moment, but I don't think they were fully broken from the way they behaved farther south. But 8 of them get ashore in the Antarctic, and unfortunately 4 die within the first month. 3 of them from eating sand, so they could get the salt in it, and 1 from eating wood shavings, which were impregnated with a poisonous substance. So Shackleton's left with just 4 ponies, and that really rather upsets his plans. He wanted to take more down so that he could get plenty of provisions farther south, but eventually they set off. Here they are with their sledge flags and nice breeze holding the flags out. 4 men, 4 dogs, and off they go. As we all know, the ponies are shot one by one and depoted as food until there is only socks left. Here, and well-known story, Socks falls down a huge crevasse, luckily leaving his leader, Frank Wild, at the top, hanging on for dear life, and even luckier, leaving the sledge behind, because they are relying on the food and equipment in that sledge for survival. If they'd lost the sledge, they wouldn't have got back. So Shackleton gets back home and is lionized, he's knighted, he's a celebrity. Meanwhile, Scott is planning his expedition. He gets Cecil Mears to go and buy these ponies in Siberia. And Cecil Mears, a bit of a funny character, but he can speak Russian, which is a great help. He too was a cavalryman in the Boer War, so he knew one end of a horse from another. And they were handed over to Captain Lawrence Oates, seen here, when they got to New Zealand. And here they are on the Terra Nova with a couple of lazy dogs. Again, a horrific journey. Ship nearly sinks. Some of the members might well have hoped that it did sink. It was so stormy, but they get ashore, have a good roll and a scratch, and they are then used to shift stores from the ship up to where the expedition hut is being built. And then they then set off on two, or rather one journey, the depot journey, where they carry food down. They're hoping to get it to latitude 82, but what with the soft surfaces, which make it very hard going for the ponies, and some blizzards, they don't get as far as they want to get. So the depot is not in the right place. Oates wants to kill the weak ponies and leave their food for later use. Scott says, no, we've got to get them all back. So we've got plenty of ponies for the main southern journey next year. So during the winter, Oates feeds up the ponies, gets them into good condition. When the sun comes back, they are exercised with their eventual leaders. So pony and man can bond and they can work together. And eventually, when the temperature rises enough at the end of October, they set off in a cavalcade. In fact, this is only a third of the cavalcade. There was also the dog teams and the motor sledges, which all traveled at different speeds. So it was a bit, well, they had to travel at the slowest, which was the ponies. They'd set off first, then the dogs, and then the motors, hopefully if they worked at all, and they'd all end up at the same place at the end of the day's work. And the pony numbers gradually dropped until eventually there were none left, and it was then a case of Shanks's pony for the final polar party to get out to the pole. Of course, they find the Norwegian flag there, and they come back and they perish. So that is the essential history of ponies in the Antarctic, except there are two more expeditions which should be mentioned. One is the Japanese expedition under Nobu Shiraza. They go down to the Bay of Whales near where Amundsen had his base, and they were going to take ponies, but their ship was so small they couldn't fit them in, so they were walking. But more important is this expedition, the second German South Pole expedition, led by Wilhelm Filchner. In fact, he said he didn't want to call it the South Pole expedition because that was not the aim. Unlike Scott, Shackleton and Amundsen, he didn't desperately want to get to the South Pole itself. He wanted to go into the interior of Antarctica to suss out the geography, basically. There was an idea the continent might be two large islands with outliers and a passage of water between them. Well, he never got near the place. They got down through the Weddell Sea to the farthest south they could get, which they call Varsel Bay, and they unloaded the ponies and the hut, started putting the hut up. But where they'd landed was in fact an iceberg abutting the main ice shelf. And there was a high spring tide. The iceberg got up and drifted off. So they had to hurriedly get everything, or nearly everything, back on board their ship, the Deutschland, and get clear. They tried once or twice more to find a landing place, failed. Then in a prequel to Endurance, they got stuck in the ice and drifted north, but unlike the Endurance, they got clear and they got out and they called back at South Georgia where they'd started, and they put their ponies ashore. And here are the four. At Grytviken, and those who know Grytviken, the cemetery is just behind this hut, which is now gone. Actually, this photograph could have been taken on the way down. The ponies have got halters on, and they've clearly just been fed. Looks like some hay on the right here, and this looks like their feed buckets, though I rather suspect one of the buckets could be the trousers of this gentleman. I'll have to investigate that. And that is the end of horses and Antarctica. Now, I've got two real topics I want to investigate. Well, I've got more, but I'll just stick to two this time. One is the feed for the ponies, and this is what Shackleton wrote in the heart of the Antarctic after the expedition. But he'd taken 20 tons of maize, half a ton of morgy ration, which is beef, carrots, milk, currants, and sugar. Bit of an odd mixture, you'd think, for a horse. And then he had 10 tons of compressed fodder, which he'd got from Australia. And this use of chaff, it's a bit awkward, because chaff in this sense means chopped green plants of cereals, oats, wheat, or maize. It's harvested when it's green and it's chopped up, and then it's compressed and they put a wire around it. So it's a very compact food, so you can get a lot on board. That was the idea. Now, I can't find out much about their feeding, but I'm intrigued about this morgy ration. It sounds Indian, but I and others have been able to find very little about it. All there is, we found mainly really, is Shackleton's description of dried beef, carrots, milk, currants, and sugar. But last week, Larry Conrad out in America sent me some press cuttings from sort of obscure American newspapers like Washington Post and National Tribune and so on, which illuminated it a lot. First of all, we've got the composition that some writers have said that it was a meat-based ration. Well, actually, it was a carrot-based ration, which is much more sensible, with small amounts of meat and sugar, rather more of currants. Milk, I don't know about. It was obviously dried milk, but a good compact ration. The ponies loved it. In fact, the men liked it. It was much nicer than their pemmican. So when they'd got rid of, Shackleton's lot had got rid of socks, they were living on morgy ration. And then I found another cutting which Larry had sent me, explaining Shackleton describing how he'd used this ration. And then I happened to be reading the diary of Eric Marshall, one of the men with Shackleton, and he spells it morgy, D-G. So I put it into Google, and up comes Wikipedia. Here we are, Cape Maud, named for Colonel I.A. Maud, who donated the morgy ration for the expedition. Eureka, that's where it comes from. It was obviously probably made by this Colonel Maud. And there's his cape on the route towards the bottom of the Beardmore Glacier. Well, I've looked at the British Army lists for this period. There is no Colonel I.A. Maud. I found 7 Mauds in the list. One of them is Colonel E.A. Maud, who was in the cavalry, but there's nothing to link him with inventing a new horse food. And it's still a mystery, and it's still something which I'm having great fun working on. Now, looking at the rations that the ponies got, it's a bit difficult because the records are so poor. You can find little snippets here and there in the diaries and the reports and so on. So Shackleton, he said that the ponies got 10 pounds of food per day. It was 8 pounds of maize, 2 pounds of morgy ration, and he felt it was sufficient. They also had this fodder of the chaff and bran and oats. And this was important because horses have very strange digestive system. And whereas they need this maize and morgy for energy, keep them going, they need fiber to keep the digestive system working properly. It's a strange system. But Shackleton seems to think 10 pounds of food per day is okay. But Scott, he has his depot journey, and he says they're fed on 10 pounds of compressed fodder, which was insufficient, not half. The diaries record how the ponies are weakening, shivering in the cold, and generally just not performing. So they increased it to 13 pounds, and it was still not enough. They learned from that, and on the southern journey, after Oates has built them up, they set off, and they're now getting 10 pounds of oats and 3 pounds of linseed oil cake, and they think this is sufficient. They're very short of this fodder, though. They only get it at the depots, and I don't think that's very good for their digestion. And there's still signs from the diaries that the ponies are failing. And this is something I want to look into. I need to get to know an equine physiologist who can help me on this. But I did find a quote that a hard-working horse needs 24 to 32 pounds of food a day, which is a lot more than Scott and Shackleton were giving their ponies. Okay, that was a hard-working horse. That was probably a farm horse, a big cart horse, and these ponies are much smaller, but they are working in very hard conditions, floundering in the snow, and also having to cope with very low temperatures. So I think I'll find that this diet was really insufficient, and the poor ponies were being starved to death, as indeed were the men. So they weren't biased at all. And I've put in these pictures just for a bit of colour. This is the maize in boxes and the compressed fodder, which you can still see at Cape Evans, Scott's base. Now we go back to snowshoes. This is, you can see the Norwegian merchant. He's now coming back from Sweden in colour. It's a lovely map. This is a part of a very big map. It's a bit fanciful. You've got 3 trolls here and some rather strange Swedish leopards. But this is to show that they had the technology of snowshoes way back then. This is middle of 16th century, but they were known much earlier, and Norwegian archaeologists have been making use of climate change. The glaciers are retreating and revealing stuff that's been lost years ago. They found a horse's hoof with an iron horseshoe on it, and here is a snowshoe, a hestestruga in Norwegian, very similar to modern ones, except that it has rope in the center rather than wire lashings. It can't be dated yet because COVID has closed down the laboratory, but it's probably about 1,000 years in the Viking Age. So a technology for horses working in the snow. And here, much later, is a Norwegian army snowshoe. These were used until superseded by helicopters. In fact, the horses have an advantage because they're moving under radar, whereas the helicopters are likely to get caught. But I want to show you this. You've got these 2 loops on the horseshoe, one each side, and then a strap and buckle for tightening it around the hoof. It looks a bit frail, but it really does work. And the Norwegian I've been talking to on Facebook sent me this film. I hope it works. Yep. They're walking along quite easily. And I'll show you, here she is with one of her horses. And the point of this, you see it's lifting up its hoof, and the horseshoe is still very firmly attached to the hoof. And I asked her, I said, how long does it take for horses to learn how to walk with snowshoes? Was it a day, a week, or a month? And she said, 5 steps, sometimes 10. In other words, they adapt very quickly, learning to splay their feet a bit. It takes a bit longer to learn how to maneuver, but it's a very simple technology. So back to Scott and the depot journey. They set off heading south with the ponies. They run into soft snow quite quickly, and the ponies are floundering, and they get out the one set of snowshoes they brought with them, and they put them on a pony called Weary Willie, and he is transformed. He's walking easily over the slough that he was floundering in beforehand. And so Scott sends back for more snowshoes, and they can't get them back, and because the ice has gone out, they can't get back to the hut. And Scott then writes a letter to his agent in New Zealand saying it's absolutely urgent. You must send more snowshoes. Get a New Zealand saddler to make them, and make them to this pattern. And you see it's a double loop, and then the thongs. And here is one that has been restored. You can see this thong. And from what I've read of the diaries, the great problem was keeping the snowshoes in place. And this is why the old pessimist Captain Oates said he thought they'd be an unmitigated nuisance. And unfortunately, there's no picture or description on how they tried to fix them. After all, ballerinas can prance around in shoes. You don't get their shoes falling off in performances. It must be possible. But it's something that Scott just never managed to crack. So he goes off South Pole, doesn't come back, and it's only after he's gone, and in fact will be on his way back from the pole, that the new snowshoes are turn up, and they come in with some mules which have been ordered from the Indian Army. They're very well trained. They've learned how to pull sledges, and here's one having the snowshoes put on, and here are 4 of them, one at each corner, and you can see these beckets, they call them. They're fixed together here, and the hoof is put in, and then this strap is buckled up tight. In fact, this one is on back to front. The other ones are facing the other way. And by all accounts, as far as I've found, these snowshoes worked very well. So they could have done it. So was it really silly taking ponies? Not really. You've got to go back and think what life was like 100 years ago. The world was still horse-drawn. Motor vehicles were a novelty. And there's a little thing, point it may not be important, that in English law, dogs may not be used as draft animals. So Scott and Shackleton may well just sort of not really thought too much about dogs. But what I think is the really bad thing, my real criticism, is that neither of these leaders really looked into the use of ponies. They spent a lot of money on motor vehicles, which they said they weren't going to rely on, but they spent so little attention to the animals which were going to be their main form of traction. Scott even goes to Norway with one of his motor sledges, takes it up into the mountains, but as far as I can see, he didn't bother to ask the Norwegians for a demonstration of how to work horses in snow. And I think that is the A1 problem. And although this is still an ongoing project, I think that will be my final conclusion. I'll just have to fill in the gaps. So there we are, something different. And it's been so nice to meet you all virtually.
Bob, that was a most enjoyable talk. We've actually got a fantastic response. Perhaps the best attended lecture so far since the first thing this morning. Unfortunately, we're a little bit tight in time, so I'm going to suggest that people park their questions and queries until the virtual Pint and O'Brien's. I'm sure Bob will be more than happy to meet you for a virtual Pint and O'Brien's this evening at 5:30.
Only a virtual one.
Well, we'll see what we can do for you, Bob. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you later. Okay, we're going to break for a little while now. We're back with Stream It Like You Mean It.
Hello everybody, my name's Wendy Driver. I live in Twickenham, just outside London. I hope you're all keeping well. I've been interested in the Antarctic for many, many years, and the picture behind me is actually of the Shackleton Glacier on Elephant Island, painted by Lucia Delirious. I love this painting. It reminds me of a wonderful expedition I did to Elephant Island many years ago with Jonathan and the descendants of the Endurance. Really looking forward to seeing you in the sessions today.
Hello, my name is Peter Fitzsimons, and on behalf of myself and my mother Jennifer, we're in Dublin, Ireland. Thank you to all the organising committee for arranging the online seminar for the Shackleton weekend. Thank you, Seamus and Kevin in particular, and my regards to Mr. and Mrs. Shackleton and to everybody from all around the world. Hopefully see you all in person soon.